All right, we'll get started. Still a fair amount of content to cover. So, welcome everybody to the third workshop. Appreciate all of you being here. Today's workshop is going to focus on the business plan for the Tech Under 20 Cup. But before we get there, we'll talk a little bit about different careers that are available in the business space and sort of how this relates to the plan. So, it'll be kind of a career discussion, discussion on the actual Tech Under 20 Cup project, and then we'll have any questions to answer at the end. Okay. So the first question when people talk about in school is that they say, I'm going to start a business or I want to study business. And like many careers in school, people often don't know what that means, right? So whether it's engineering or business or other things, people don't know too much about it, right? Because you're in school, that's sometimes all you know. So sometimes when people think about business, they think about this. Um, so some of you might have been following what's happening with the stock market, and you might have heard about Wall Street bets. So sometimes people think business is like that. Um, Other times they'll think you just walk around wearing a suit all the time, right? And that's what business is. You just walk around, shake hands pre-COVID, and make deals, right? But what does that even mean, right? So when talking about these different areas, um, there's sort of six main areas of business I think are good to think about. So sales, marketing, management, HR, product management, and finance. And at the end of the day, it's about the skills required to grow a business. So usually when people talk about growing a business or the business side of things, they usually mean this. And then you have sort of the engineering or building or product development side. So you either build stuff or you sell stuff. That's kind of the simple way of thinking about jobs. And these are sort of more on the sales business side things. So the goal is today to go through some of these different options and talk a little bit about the roles and how they connect to your Tech Under 20 plan. Okay, we'll start off with sales. So often when we think about sales, we think about a sleazy car salesperson who's trying to sell you a car that's going to break down in 5 minutes. But it's a lot different than that, right? So sometimes you have that assumption that you're just going to sell stuff and that's all you need to know. So we have a Dilbert cartoon here, sort of depicting sometimes how we make these projections. But there's a method to this, right? So apart from people just physically trying to sell you something, you typically want to build out what's called a sales funnel. And a sales funnel sort of communicates the different stages that somebody who might want to buy a product is at, right? So the first one, and is kind of marketing related, is awareness of your brand, right? So we all know what Google is, for example. Most of us know what Google ads are, but not all of us are buying Google ads, right? So that's the difference between 1 and 5, right? And depending on what you're selling, these might look very different, right? So if you're selling computers to someone, this process is different than if you're trying to sell in-game purchases, right? For some kind of app. But the sales cycle, as we call it, is all the way through this. And there's so much to learn about sales, but if you're selling sort of a product to a big company, the sales cycle, sort of this whole funnel, might take you 2 years, right? As opposed to if somebody's trying to download an app, then that sales cycle might take you like 1 hour, right? So it's very different depending on what you're trying to sell. For the Tech Under 20 Cup side of things, there's a couple of questions here. So the most important one is who's going to pay for your product, right? Or who's going to fund it? And depending on what your product is, it might be sold to businesses, it might be sold to charities, it might be a government service. You should be able to answer this question where money is coming from. And the answer might be, well, nobody really pays for the product itself, but we might have some donations or whatever. That's still some kind of business model that you should communicate. Next, you should start thinking about how you fill this pipeline, right? So this starts get into marketing and sort of growth strategy, and you don't have to go into super depth about it, but you should think about it, right? So if you're selling some kind of app, let's say it's a messaging app, why would people use it instead of Instagram DMs or Facebook or Snapchat or even TikTok, right? Or LinkedIn, I don't know. WhatsApp, Telegram, all these different apps, right? So there's all these things that exist already. So why would you use your new app, right? So you need to explain that, right? Because you're starting off at a disadvantage. There's prioritizing features, right? So how do you know what to build? Who do you listen to? And we'll talk a little bit more about that in product management. And how do you convince people to switch platforms, right? So it's kind of related to question number 2. How do you fill that pipeline? So they should start getting some thoughts turning in your head. And as always, we have more sort of guidelines in the business plan doc, but it's all kind of connected. Okay, marketing. So marketing is kind of the top of the sales funnel, and marketing and sales should be in sync with each other. Otherwise, you're communicating a platform that's different, and it causes friction. One of the areas you might have heard of recently, which has gotten trendy, is growth hacking, which is sort of people call it a new way of marketing. And this graph sort of depicts it, right? So you sort of use a data focused and psychology approach to growing your business. And here is sort of an ad that's kind of interesting from Wealth Simple. You might have seen it before on your phone. And it basically is like one of those charts, like the race charts. And it shows sort of how different stocks were being traded at the beginning of 2020. So it's an interesting ad because it's sort of a little bit suspenseful. There's motion and all that stuff. So it's fairly good. This is another ad run by KFC. It's a little bit edgy. Obviously, they rearranged the KFC letters, and this was about sort of dealing with a PR issue about their products actually containing chicken, right? So interesting philosophies, right? And marketing, there's different approaches, right? It could be a very creative approach, it could be a very data-driven approach, sort of as depicted here in this Venn diagram. But you should start thinking about marketing as not just like, oh, I'm gonna sell some ads, I'm going to use word of mouth, right? It's a little bit more comprehensive than that. So in previous years at the Cup, the number of times we've heard, oh, we're going to use word of mouth marketing or social media marketing, it's like, okay, that's great, those are your channels, but how are you going to do it, right? What strategies are you going to undertake? Are you going to use edgy ads? Are you going to run ads at all? Are you going to recruit influencers? Are you going to try to create really good content? Sort of, and why do you think that's going to work, right? Because anybody can spend money on social media ads, but not all of them work. And you probably saw that in one of the previous workshops when talking about user prototyping with some of the Tech Under 20 ads that we've run in the past. So then you get sort of to your fundamental questions that are helpful for any marketer, but also for the TU20 Cup plan. So who's your audience? What are your different channels? And channels are sort of how you connect with your audience, whether it's through social media, Instagram, Snapchat, would be different channels, TikTok, whether it's word of mouth, sort of a non-formal channel, whether it's TV, radio, sort of older channels, right? So how do you know if an ad is going to be successful, right? So that's a good question to ask. How do you measure success, and how do you replicate that success? Because again, it's very easy just to spend money on a problem, but how do you know if a marketing ad works? Then when talking about word of mouth or engagement, right? Like, why will people talk about these ads, right? So this Wealth Simple ad, people might talk about it because like investing is kind of interesting and it's a way of making money, but a lot of people don't understand it. This ad is because it's edgy and it's sort of clever and the wordplay. and sort of the big text grabs your attention, and then you have to read the fine print, right? So thinking about that as well. And then some other metrics. So you can read about this more, but there are sort of two metrics, CAC, which is cost of acquisition, and LTV, which is lifetime value for a customer. So basically you're comparing, if it costs me $10 to acquire a customer, but they're only going to pay $5 to me in total over the course of using the app, right? Does that make sense as a strategy? And the answer is usually no. So again, you don't have to become a marketing expert, but depending on your team's approach to the Tech Under 20 Cup, it's useful to think about these things and find the different approaches to address these questions. Okay. Before I go on to management, actually, I'll pause on sales and marketing. Did anybody have any questions? You can type them out in the chat. Okay. I'll keep going and get to the questions if there are any. Okay, management. So when people talk about management or leadership experience, like you typically write on your resume, like, oh, I've led this club before, or I have this leadership experience. And management is kind of a hard thing to teach. It takes practice and sort of just being cautious of communication and other skills. So I guess these two graphics sort of provide a good contrast to skills. So on the left here, we see sort of a boss versus a leader. If something goes wrong, like you blame your employees for everything that's happening. You sort of inspire fear and sort of work as a dictator, right? As opposed to some of these other quantities, right? And everybody's going to have their own graph and their metrics, but I think this captures these things, right? Being a very good communicator, communicating your vision, leading by example, putting in the effort, sort of being someone that your team can relate to, right? So super important. This is something hopefully that you're learning throughout the Tech Under 20 Cup itself, even if it's not a deliverable, right? How do you work in a team? How do you communicate? How do you delegate responsibilities? How do you stay motivated by this, right? So we're still in sort of a Zoomiversity phase. COVID is still a thing. You're working on this cool project that you've sort of been thinking about. So how do you inspire yourselves, right? So very, very good question and a very good experience to learn about these things. Yeah, so in your Tech Under 20 Cup plan, you don't necessarily have to talk about this too much. It'll kind of relate more to the HR side of things, but you want to think about how you're going to build a good team, right? So as always, if you're ever going to start a business or lead a team, you'll need a good team. Parts of it is coaching people, parts of it is attracting good talent, right? So all of you probably have role models you look up to. Elon Musk, for example, has sort of a cult of his personality. If he calls you right now, probably 99% of you are going to answer the phone and say, I'll start tomorrow, right? You don't even have to pay me, right? Because he's such a magnetic personality, right? So attracting and building talent is super important, and we'll talk a little bit more about it in the HR section. So HR is also something that people don't typically understand too much. On the left here are some career areas that you can sort of focus in on. If you're running a startup sort of in the technology space or building a product, at first sort of talent management is your most important focus, and it kind of ties to compensation. And then other things sort of tie in, right? And they're all kind of related, right? So it's hard to have good talent management if you're not building an inclusive environment, right? Et cetera. So all of these things are interesting career areas, and they apply to different stages of companies. What I would say is that for the sake of the cup, we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of talent management and growth, and sort of how organizations are structured. But as I encourage you through all these careers and areas, go find somebody to talk to. Tech Under 20 hopefully provides you a forum for different means, whether it's meet a mentor or learn to get hired or other initiatives. But as always, I'm doing a super fast take on all of this. Each of these areas and each of the sales areas and marketing have so many things to teach. So sort of take note what you find interesting and continue exploring those areas. And then sort of as HR has been evolving, and people call it human resources, sort of analytics and other things become more and more relevant, right? So this is a solution out there called Workday, but there are many other companies. And you can sort of see trends across your company. So if you're talking about diversity and inclusion, you can sort of look at a metric on gender, right? So if your company previously struggled, let's say on hiring female developers, you need to track those metrics somewhere, right? To again validate if the behavior changes you're implementing in the company, whether it's policy or hiring practices, are actually working, right? Likewise with pay, turnover, employee surveys, like all of these things should be measured. And in the HR space, it typically lags behind other areas, but HR could be interesting from that perspective as well. So from a Tech Under 20 Cup perspective, there's sort of two things, right? The main one is sort of team strengths and weaknesses. So hopefully your team is well rounded and you can deliver on all the different expectations we have for you. And if you can't, hopefully you're learning, right? Great learning opportunity. And within your report, you can sort of include what your plans are for the future, right? So if you're a team of 4 devs, let's say, and you might have found some of the business side of things a little bit more challenging. Maybe your plan is like saying, look, we're going to get this product to sort of an MVP, and then we'll try to bring in somebody who can help us out more, right? Because we struggled with it. And that's a good assessment to make, as opposed to sort of a judge making that assessment for you, right? So more relevant for the cup itself. Okay, product management. So this area has been getting quite a lot of hype on LinkedIn, sort of in the student community. People typically consider it to be like being a mini CEO, which in theory is correct, but in practice, not so much, right? So this is a cool graph. It's sort of the folks at Product Plan surveyed some product managers, and they talked about what the most important skills are for a product manager. And a product manager is the person who's accountable for the progress of the product. So they're kind of in the middle of a lot of things, right? So between, let's say, developers, salespeople, customers, marketing, you name it, right? So it's not too surprising that communication skills are so important, right? And this kind of talks about another interesting graphic on where product management is right, is sort of the intersection of user-focused design and engineering sometimes, and sort of general communication, right? So there are certainly very glorious moments. If you're the product manager, product owner, let's say, of a very successful feature, that's awesome. But to actually get to success, it's not just you sitting down by a whiteboard and deciding what features are working. Is you heavily prioritizing, communicating with everybody, getting overwhelmed by sometimes positive feedback, sometimes negative feedback. So you're kind of the focal point of communication. So it's important to remember to be user focused. And if you're interested in sort of communication and organization and planning, this might be a good career option as well. But for the Tech Under 20 Cup, sort of, again, being user focused, when you're pitching why your idea is going to work, you're doing a mini product management presentation, right? You're saying, this is the product we've ideated, that we've communicated to users. This is why it's feasible. So you're essentially playing the role of a product manager, without too much external feedback, right? The real role of a product manager is that if you asked all the Tech Under 20 Cup judges to give you an opinion, and then you had to pick the top 2 features, that would be actual product management, and that would be quite hard. Okay, finance. So we talked about Wall Street bets, but that's not sort of what startup finance is. Um, so this is an interesting graph, sort of talking about what you use money for in a startup, right? So this valley of death has been referred to for a number of years. Um, the author, his last name is Banks, um, or Steve Blank, sorry, not Banks. Steve Blank sort of formalized this phrase and pattern. He talks about that you need this initial capital from angel investors or from your friends and family. That's what FFF stands for, friends, family, and fools, to actually get to the point where you have a feasible product. And this is where a lot of companies die. And then after that, you sort of accelerate that growth, accelerate your revenue, get to success, and then sometimes sort of get listed on a stock exchange. So money is typically used at the beginning to discover what your users actually want to build out your MVP, and then afterwards to sort of accelerate the growth. At the same time, so I'll get to that later. So the questions you're asking yourself for the Tech Under 20 Cup are, what are your costs, right? So generally you want to have some kind of information on that. You don't have to say we're going to spend $50,000 on developers, 5,000 on this. You can sort of approximate and say this is where we anticipate the costs are going to be. And then they'll relate to the other things, right? To marketing and all the other stuff. Customer acquisition versus product delivery. So where you're spending your money on making the product better versus acquiring customers. Who's actually paying for it? So it goes back to the sales slide. How are you funding the venture, right? Going back to the sales slide. The difference between revenue and cash flow. So this is super important. Cash flow is king. You might hear that phrase. So cash flow is how much money you have in your account that you're able to spend, because sometimes you might have a lot of revenue coming in, but it's not right now, right? And then you need to pay a bill right now. Otherwise, your company goes bankrupt. So a lot of companies actually fail on this account, that they're not cash flow positive. And as always, please read up more on it. An interesting sort of tidbit is that Amazon for a very long time was not profitable as a company. I think it was for most of the first 20 years, but they were always cash flow positive, meaning that they can always pay their bills on time, but they might have not been making a net profit. So again, an interesting distinction. And then sort of relating to that, it's not so relevant to the Tech Under 20 Cup, but as a startup founder, you think about how much time are you actually spending pitching to VCs or to customers, because if you're not careful, that might become sort of the CEO's and VP of sales job forever, right? And that's not what they're supposed to do, right? Okay, so I'll pause now and I'll show you in, bring your shared window. It's weird. Sorry, 1 second. All right. So this charity data website, I wanted to show you this because some of you might be building sort of more of a, not necessarily a startup, but a project that would be government funded or sort of a charity or nonprofit. So there's a cool website here called Charity Data, which actually shows you how charities in Canada are actually like spending their money, right? So this is the Toronto Public Library, and you can sort of see their information. You can see their revenue and expenditures. You can look at their assets, liabilities, who's on the board of directors. And this is just sort of aggregating the data from, I guess, the government websites and other sources, because charities have to sort of publish a lot of this information, just like public companies. So you can go in here and look up for charity. So for example, the charity we worked with, let's say YMCA, right? Want to look up YMCA, sure, Chatham Kent YMCA, right? No, here's the information. So very small, I guess, branch. You can see sort of the revenue and expenditures are quite small. They don't really have a lot of staff, right? 0 full-time. So yeah, so this hopefully will give you some more information about how these organizations function. Okay. So that was it from that part. What I wanted to do now is go through a little bit through the actual Tech Under 20 plan. Okay, so the participant guide, all of you should be best friends by now with it. Lots of good information. So we'll sort of go through that. So for submission 3 of the business plan, you basically want to tell us why your project is going to be successful. So we have a sample here and how to submit it. And then this format document is this one over here. Great, so your business plan is going to be 4 pages long. We call it a project proposal. If you hear me saying business plan, I mean project proposal, it's the same thing. Basically, it's going to have 6 different sections. So an introduction, sort of what problem you're solving, the market research, what's the product, what's your financial situation going to be like, and how are you going to add features, right? And we have sort of specific instructions for the market research. So this is kind of your user-focused design stuff. So all the user research you've been doing, you get to sort of showcase it in this section. And we sort of added more guidelines here just so it's a little easier, because you don't learn this stuff in school, right? User-focused design typically. So yeah. So that's the business plan. And from a marking perspective, it's fairly significant, right? It's 25% roughly of your grade. So please spend some time on it, and everything you've been doing sort of builds toward it. So will this be emailed to us? You have access to all of this, right? You have access to the participant guide, and everything is linked from there. Yeah, so the market research plan is just in the, like it's in here, the project proposal, and then you have the link there. So you have 4 pages. You basically want to write up why your venture is going to work, and sort of back it up with sort of your user research, your market research, sort of why your product is good, etc. There's also a sample business plan here. This one, I wouldn't say is perfect by any means, but hopefully it should give you some context. So this was written last year, not by a real team, I don't think. And it's just an example for our green app with all the different sections. Again, it's not perfect. This will probably score you average, maybe slightly below average, but hopefully it gives you a perspective on what to include. And then, as always, you have the judging criteria, so you can actually see what questions are going to be asked and how you're going to be graded. And then, as always, in the participant guide, guiding questions and everything else. Okay. The biggest takeaway, though, is that your user research should be a very substantial part of your plan. So when I sort of had these guiding questions here, right, from sales, marketing, right, all the way down to finance and product management, all of this is about like, how do you prove to us, how do you show to us as the judges, or the judges rather, that it's going to work, right? And user feedback is very, very crucial for that. Okay, so the business plan is due on the 21st. So you guys got an extension until the 4th, I think, for the user feedback. So you'll have a little bit of time to keep thinking about your business plan. Basically, the way the logistics will work is that you'll submit this business plan ahead of time, so before the actual competition. And then the business judges will read it ahead of the competition. And then when you do your actual presentation, you'll sort of the judges will know a little bit about your company or whatever you're proposing, and then they'll cross-reference it with the details in your business plan. So sort of after the 21st, you should be mainly working on your pitches and finalizing your product/prototype. But most of the business research and viability and user feedback should be done by here. Okay, so I'll pause there. Talked about a lot of stuff. Does anybody have any questions? So, question in the chat. I'm not sure too much what you mean. So the prototype iterations are something very valuable to share as evidence on why you think your app's going to work, right? So within that product management sort of sales perspective, you can say, when people use this app, they found it intuitive. It was easy to use. These are sort of the pieces of feedback we got. And whenever you build your user interface or your app or whatever it might be, you're never going to get it right on the first try. It might be good, right? But people are going to be like, okay, I don't really understand what this button is for, or this isn't what I want to accomplish, right? So when you sell me, I don't know, a food delivery app, I don't want you to rank everything by price first. I want to see pictures, right? So just as an example, so iterations will help you build a more successful prototype. So you may choose to just use Figma or your design tool to house your final prototype. Other teams might be focused on actually coding it up. And it's faster to prototype than it is to code. So that's sort of why we encourage you to iterate on it. Hope that makes sense. Okay. And there's no real maximum of iterations. You can do as many as you want. It's just sort of a time limit, right? So you can have like 50 different mockups and run it by 1,000 people. We won't stop you for that. That's awesome. But you just might not have time. We just encourage you to iterate on it fairly consistently. Okay. Question about, if you're leaning towards being a not-for-profit, is fundraising going to be the majority of the financial outline? So perhaps I just encourage you to be creative. Fundraising is a double-edged sword, right? If you actually look through some of that charity data, sometimes charities spend 50% of their money to keep raising money, right? Which isn't super effective. Building a product is actually sort of the best way to help someone out, or to build consistent revenue and make sure that your product is good, right? Fundraising is certainly a big part, and it's interesting because the government of Canada is actually encouraging charities and not-for-profits to build useful products. They have a big granting program and competition running right now for it. You can actually read more about it. But fundraising has its own challenges. It's affected sort of by people's whims. It's not the most efficient way to sort of build money and validate your product, but unfortunately, that's what a lot of the current industry does. So yeah, you can be sort of as bold or sort of stick to the tried and true ways as you want. But yeah, but mainly think about sort of why why you're targeting sort of your sources of finance, right? if you're a not-for-profit, sure, you can target fundraising, but why, right? And if you can't answer that question, the judges are going to be like, okay, we're not sure if this is the best approach or if they're even going to be successful. So make sure you can answer the question why. What's the best way to price a product? Okay. Um, I don't think there's a right answer for that, but there is a bunch of different models out there. So most of you are probably familiar with freemium, right? You have a free app and then you pay for in-app purchases. Um, Other things are sort of tiers of pricing, right? So you might have like a super simple version, and you sort of, if you look at a company's page, you might start off as like free, and then like free trial, subscription, then like business, and then enterprise, right? And there's different features available. There's also sort of a consumption-based model. So something that a lot of companies have been doing recently, especially in the cloud space, is that they charge you per unit of something. So for example, if you're going to upload a gigabyte of data into Google Drive, right now what Google does instead is says, I might give you a terabyte of data, right? But you pay the same whether or not you use all of it. But if you upload it into Google Cloud Storage, which is like their like actual software development tool, you'll be charged per gigabyte or per megabyte or whatever. So it's a usage-based model. So this is its own topic. There's thousands of talks and resources about it. Think about sort of how you're going to incentivize people to join, right? So maybe the customers you're targeting don't want to use a free product, ironically. Like big companies would prefer to pay if they get the features, right? As opposed to sort of a business to consumer app. So like what we typically use, like we probably find that if we have to pay something on the app store, we just don't download it, right? We look for the best free version. So a lot of things to think about, and I guess a lot of research you can do. The main thing is just do your research and justify it, right? I don't think there's a wrong answer. All right. So yeah, so don't forget to submit your user feedback things by Thursday. The business plan again is due on February 21st. If you have any questions, you can email the Tech Under 20 email, or more easily message in the Discord and the Cup channels. It's an iterative process. It's good to start early and talk to your mentors about it. You should have two mentors. They should be able to provide you some great feedback. Whether they're a tech or business mentor, they'll ask sort of these important questions because they've built teams or products before, and this stuff comes up all the time. All right. So we'll wrap it up here. Thanks everyone for joining. Hopefully this was useful, and wish you good luck on the business plan and the rest of the cup.